You are listening to Aeri Awakening by Kai Stormhaven. Chapter 24. Lorenessa ignored the sharp sting of branches whipping her face as she rushed through the thick tangle of cedar trees and sage that separated her from the road. She could feel Jesha's Aeri ahead of her, close enough that she should be able to see her soon. She tried to control her emotions before they put both Jesha and herself in more danger than they were already in. Ignoring her fear of what they might have done to Jesha, however, was as easy as cutting off one of her fingers. There would be plenty of time for rage after Jesha was safe. Her long legs were swiftly closing the distance between her and Jesha's captors when she felt them slow to a halt ahead of her. Lorenessa slowed down and approached cautiously, slipping between the trees like a ghost. Lieutenant Sanders was standing on the road with Jesha over one shoulder, facing the thick brush he had just exited, where Lorenessa slowly snaked through the last few remaining bushes. There was a second man next to Lieutenant Sanders, dressed in silks fine enough for any lord, with a curved sword belted to his side. His face was almost inhuman, white-skinned and marked on either cheekbone with a triangular symbol. Lorenessa gave a start when she saw his eyes. They were dark brown, with no pupils or whites. He towered over Lieutenant Sanders by a good 6 inches, though Sanders himself would have been accounted a tall man. Lorenessa gave a second start as she realized she could not feel his resonance or any kind of Aeri emanating from him. It didn't matter. He would have to die as well, regardless of what he was. Those questions could be answered later. Launching herself through the last line of cedar trees, Lorenessa swept toward the alien-looking stranger, guessing he would be the more dangerous of the two. He stood staring at her as she rushed toward him, though it was difficult to tell if he were looking at her, since he did not possess any pupils. His expression never changed as he watched her quickly close the distance, his stance never shifting. Lieutenant Sanders was already backing away from her fury, his eyes widening in alarm at her sudden appearance. Lorenessa brought her dagger up at the last second in an underhanded jab at the tall form's throat. Her eyes widened in surprise as her dagger passed through insubstantial air, causing her to fall forward slightly. She brought her knee up toward his groin as she prepared for the sudden impact, and felt her next shock as his hand darted out and grabbed her throat in a death grip that threatened to make her pass out. She brought her palm up sharply at his elbow, expecting the sharp crack of bone. Her eyes widened in panic as her hand passed right through where his elbow should have been. She struck out with her Aeri, causing sharp detonations of air where his head and chest should have been. Her Aeri had no more effect than her knife had. His expressionless face changed slightly. He smiled cruelly, his dark eyes making the smile seem more sinister. A moment later, Lorenessa felt an uncomfortable pressure begin building in her head and chest, as well as an alien Aeri enter her body. Before she had time for shock to settle in, she began fighting with everything she knew, her legs kicking in the empty air at the form's chest, at the same time as her Aeri attacked the new Aeri that had begun forming inside her. She felt a dual sense of panic and realized that whatever being was trying to take over her body could feel her violent attempts to block the intrusion and was worried that she might succeed. As she felt the other being's anxiety, she renewed her efforts to block the thing from her body. She had no idea what she was doing as she flailed about with a part of her Aeri she hadn't known existed. She felt several odd popping sensations, and suddenly her arms and legs stopped kicking. Stark terror overwhelmed her remaining emotions as she realized she had lost control of her motor functions. She lashed out with the last of her strength and was rewarded with a sharp concussion. All sensation vanished. The creature that held her by the throat gave out a sharp keening sound as he was hurled backward through the air more than 20 paces. When he hit the ground, he didn't stop, but slipped through the solid earth as if it were air as well. Lorenessa looked around herself, her vision oddly blurred. She tried to look over to where Lieutenant Sanders stood with Jesha over his shoulder, but her head would not obey her. She suddenly realized that the other Aeri she had felt was still in her body, and that it had taken control of most of her functions. She could feel its spirit sliding up and down her skeletal structure where it had attached itself after breaking her own connection. Her own spirit felt like clothing that had been merely pinned to her body, flapping around her body as it moved, instead of causing her body to move. The creature possessing her body seemed to be feeling it out, as if it were unused to the sensation. Lorenessa felt violated beyond anything she thought possible as she felt the alien spirit shifting through her, brushing against her own spirit in the tight enclosure of her body. If she could have vomited, she would have. She felt irritation flicker through the other spirit as it realized that she was still attached, however precariously, as well as puzzlement. She had a feeling that it had no idea of how to rid itself of her. "Is it you or Lorenessa?" Lieutenant Sanders' voice demanded behind her. Her body turned to face Lieutenant Sanders. He stood holding Jesha up in front of him with a knife to her throat. "It's Dimitri," her voice replied of its own accord. It had a strange, clipped accent that made her voice sound like a different person. Her arms raised themselves in front of her face, and she felt her eyes gazing at them wonderingly. She could also feel the other spirit's wonder as it reveled in the new sensations of a mortal body. Lieutenant Sanders lowered the knife slightly. "We had better leave before any of the others show up." He kept staring back in the thick brush toward the camp. "Yes, we need to leave," Dimitri agreed, focusing on the land around him. "Where are your men?" "The main body will be in the town of North Fork," Lieutenant Sanders replied, unable to keep his gaze from traveling over her body as he stared at her. Lorenessa felt her body begin moving down the road toward North Fork. She tried to attach her flapping spirit to her skeletal structure again, but it was like trying to make a piece of cloth stick to the wall. She could feel amusement dripping from Dimitri as she fumbled with her tattered spirit, which only fueled the rage burning deep within her. She reached out with her Aeri to try to cause an air detonation that would break her leg, but felt a confining tightness around her Aeri that kept it from reacting. She felt her rage ebb slightly as the first traces of helpless despair began filling her awareness. "When is your master going to join us?" Lieutenant Sanders asked casually, but Lorenessa could almost feel the waves of uneasiness emanating from him. "Soon," Dimitri promised without elaborating. Lorenessa could feel the fear in Dimitri when he thought of his master, though he attempted to keep the fear from her face. The two of them stopped as they heard the sound of horses moving toward them. A moment later, 30 mounted men came cantering around a bend in the road, reining in when they saw Lieutenant Sanders. He walked up to one of the soldiers and dumped Jesha over the front of the saddle. "You two can walk from here?" Sanders told 2 of the soldiers, motioning for them to dismount. After Sanders and Dimitri had mounted the new horses, the fox-faced lieutenant motioned the other soldiers to follow as they rode back toward the town of North Fork. Lorenessa spent the entire ride trying to push through the odd barrier, holding her Aeri from expanding, trying to find some kind of weakness. The dripping amusement from Dimitri only spurred her to continue searching for a way to escape. "I have never had a woman's body before," Dimitri told Sanders as they made their way through the town's wooden gate. "Perhaps you and a few of your soldiers could accommodate me tonight and help me break it in." Sanders's face reddened as his eyes filled with lust. "I don't have a problem with that." He looked back at the massively muscled captain behind him. "Do you have a problem with that, Captain Jork?" Captain Jork shook his head slowly, licking his lips like a goat as he stared at Lorenessa's body greedily. Lorenessa tried to stifle the rising panic that threatened to erase all thought, knowing that it would only increase Dimitri's satisfaction. But she couldn't seem to stop the terror from flooding through her mind as she hung frozen in limbo, forced to watch helplessly as this animal defiled her body. Lochnar studied the tracks on the road, frowning in puzzlement. He could see where Lorenessa had run forward to attack someone, but then her tracks came to an abrupt halt and were only partially visible through the imprint of where her body had fallen. He could see one other person's tracks, obviously the one who had captured Jesha from the awkward gait he had taken. But from everything he could see, there must have been a third person. The most confusing variable was the set of Lorenessa's tracks that followed the abductor's tracks, without any sign of struggling or coercion. Lochnar couldn't fathom why Lorenessa would suddenly join the abductor of her own free volition. There was something very wrong. He squinted at the sun that was slowly sliding behind the eastern horizon, grimacing at the possibilities. A moment later, he was stepping out of the physical realm into the realm of negatives, and then back into the physical realm, a mile closer to North Fork. He continued jumping ahead, sometimes a few thousand feet, sometimes several miles. The realm of negatives had no absolutes to it. What was a mile once could be 5 miles the next time. Before the sun had even finished disappearing behind the horizon, he was already in the town of North Fork. He reached out with his Aeri, feeling for Lorenessa's resonance. He swore loudly as he found nothing that resembled her resonance, causing several farmers passing on a wagon to look at him askance. He reached out again, looking for Jesha's resonance, this time finding a match to what he remembered of Jesha. He opened a link to the realm of negatives, allowing it to flood into the physical realm around his being, wiping out any traces of his Aeri and resonance. Walking quietly through the mostly empty streets of North Fork, Lochnar made his way toward the inn at the North Gate, where he felt Jesha's resonance. The street in front of the 3 inns by North Gate was filled with horses that the officers had picketed in front of the large buildings. Lochnar slipped through the front door as a rumpled-looking sergeant walked out of the inn. The common room was full of soldiers drinking and gambling. A young, tawny-haired woman sang a bawdy song on a small stage at the end of the room. Lochnar ignored the soldiers, moving instead up the stairway to the 2nd story. There were 2 soldiers standing guard outside the room where he felt Jesha, both of them staring at the door across the hall from them as if they could see through it. Lochnar quietly closed in on them, jabbing each of them in throat in quick succession, then grabbing them and slowly lowering them to the floor to avoid the noise of their bodies collapsing. As he reached for the door handle to the room that Jesha was in, he heard Lorenessa's voice in the room across the hall. He paused, listening with a frown as he pulled his hand away from Jesha's door handle. "This chit is still a virgin," Lorenessa's voice said scornfully on the other side of the door. "So you had better take it easy. If I feel any pain, you are going to feel it 10 times more, Sanders." Lochnar's frown deepened. Lorenessa's voice was the same, but he recognized the accent too well. Leaning back, Lochnar kicked Lorenessa's door open, pulling out his invisible sword as he walked into the room. Sanders stood in front of a bed, naked from the waist down, staring at the door in shock. He saw the 2 dead soldiers lying in the hallway and hurriedly snatched his short sword from a small table. He ran toward the door half naked, staring right through the place where Lochnar was. Lochnar did not even bother cutting him down with his sword as he passed, but slammed his palm in a cutting motion against Sanders' neck. Sanders immediately dropped to the wood floor like a sack of meal. Lorenessa had been lying on the only bed in the room, completely naked. She was just in the act of standing up when Sanders dropped. She froze, and Lochnar could feel the evictor's Aeri reaching out to feel the room. He moved toward the evictor, not even thinking of it as Lorenessa, now that he knew for sure that it was an evictor, and raised his sword to strike its neck as it stared through him. Just before he began the swing, he realized he could feel Lorenessa's Aeri inside the body still. He backed silently away, trying to puzzle out what had happened. He could feel the evictor's Aeri covering her entire body, but at the same time, he could feel Lorenessa's Aeri, all disjointed, as if it had been disconnected somehow. That would explain why he had not felt her resonance. After several moments when no ideas formulated, he walked over to her and struck her on the neck, knocking her out cold. He would have to take her to Thistledown and hope that the little gnome had some ideas. He pulled some clothes on her before throwing her light form over his shoulder, walked across the hall to Jesha's room, and kicked the door in. The room was small, with a single bed and small round table with 2 chairs next to the window. Jesha was on the floor in a heap, with thick blood crusted up in her light hair above her eyes. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and her breath came out raggedly. Lochnar set Lorenessa down on the ground next to him and pulled Jesha up to a sitting position in front of him. As softly as a feather, he began probing the large gash in her forehead with his fingers. Lochnar's eyebrows rose in surprise that she was still alive when he felt the large crack in her cartilaginous skull. He reached out with his Aeri and began mending the bone back together before slowly lacing the tissue together as well. She still had too little blood left in her body to last very long, and her body was fevered from the beginnings of an infection. She would also have to wait on thistledown. Lochnar had never been good at healing people. He spent most of his time killing people, so there was little reason to learn how to heal them. For the third time in a week, he used the inner link that he shared with Thistledown, growling to himself in irritation. "Come to the lucky door in North Fork." He tried to put a small sense of urgency in the sending. He could feel the soldiers on the ground floor becoming steadily drunker as the evening progressed. Lochnar closed the door and walked over to the window next to the table. He looked down into the street where several soldiers were trying to charm some of the local women, succeeding as often as not. Still staring out the window, Lochnar began probing Lorenessa with his Aeri, trying to puzzle out the unexplainable presence of her own spirit in a body that an evictor had dominated. It was troubling that the evictor had been able to break through her aura without the aid of Aeri Astra. Lorenessa's spirit was filled with relief so strong that Lochnar half expected her body to awaken. Her spirit was obviously still aware of her surroundings, even though her body was unconscious, which meant her spirit must have been separated from her body even more than Lochnar first believed. Lochnar continued studying her body, where it should have fastened to her spirit. The vinculum had been burned off her legs and arms, and there was only a small amount left on the rest of her skeletal structure. The evictors didn't use the outer shell of vinculum that grew along the skeletal structure, enabling a spirit to latch onto a body and grow with it. Jared had created what he called barbs for the evictors, small barbs of coarse spiritual matter that penetrated deeply into the soft core of vinculum, making an anchor for the evictor spirit to attach to the body with. Somehow, the evictor would have to be removed from her body, and her vinculum would need to be repaired so that it could attach to her body once more. Lochnar turned toward the door as he felt several of the drunken soldiers moving up the stairs. Their voices were loud and boisterous, interspersed with drunken laughter. "Lieutenant, are you through with her yet?" one of the drunken soldiers bawled from down the hall. "We want a turn, too." Lochnar waited until they were entering the room across from him before quietly opening the door and moving behind the four inebriated men. They were staring stupidly at Sanders's comatose body on the floor when Lochnar entered, whipping his sword out and beheading the first man in one swift motion. Before the remaining three soldiers had a chance to start moving, their heads were already rolling across the floor to join the first. Wiping his blade on Sanders' motionless form, Lochnar resheathed his sword with a sense of satisfaction. For some reason, killing people always seemed to calm his nerves. Lochnar heard movement in the room where he had left Lorenessa and Jesha. After making a quick scan of the room with his Aeri, Lochnar strode back across the hall to the other room, closing the door behind him. Jesha was shaking Lorenessa lightly, trying to rouse her. "Leave her be," Lochnar growled, scowling at the small Saren. Jesha gave a start when she saw him scowling down at her, but a moment later, she was hovering over Lorenessa again, squeezing her hand. "I can still feel her in this body, and she needs a friend," Jesha said in her dual-toned Saren voice. Lochnar grunted sourly, walking over to the window. More than likely, the fool girl would wake the evictor, and it would be up to Lochnar to save her fool neck. Even so, he didn't insist that she back away from Lorenessa. He could feel the warmth from Lorenessa's spirit, a thick flow that carried love and fondness in it. Lochnar felt Thistledown's presence moving closer, now somewhere near the town gates. Raya's resonance seemed more pronounced than it had before she had disappeared, with a kind of purity in its core that burned brighter than the sun. Lochnar wondered how giving a piece of his own core had caused such a drastic effect. That was, however, a question for another day. The strange girl from the other world must have learned to control her resonance to some degree, because it was no louder than the other people around her now. The torches that lit the wide road cast flickering shadows on the buildings that lined the street. Human eyes would have had trouble seeing through the poor light, but Lochnar's Graelyn heritage had given him the same ability to see well at night that Saren's possessed. After several minutes of waiting, Thistledown came into sight with the rest of their group. Raya, Leanne, and Lori were riding 3 of the horses that Lorenessa had brought with her, with Thalion leading the pack horse by the lead rope. Leanne seemed to be wincing at every step her horse took, and Thalion kept eyeing the pack horse he was leading distrustfully. Raya was an accomplished rider, but Lochnar was surprised to see Lori handling her reins with a confidence that came from years of experience riding horses. She must have been from a wealthy family, wherever she was from. As Thistledown's companions reined in at the front of the building, an armored soldier walked toward him purposefully. "This inn is sold out for the night." The soldier waved impatiently for them to move on. "You'll need to find another place to sleep." Thistledown ignored him, tying Raya's reins to a post at the front of the building. The soldier shouted something angrily, but before he could utter a complete word, he slid limply to the ground. Lochnar felt Thistledown's Aeri expand into the inn with a wavelength with which Lochnar was not familiar. A moment later, the inn was silent as the drunken laughter below him cut off. Frowning, Lochnar tried to puzzle out what Thistledown had done. The wavelength that Thistledown had saturated the rest of the inn with had been too weak to forcefully knock a person out, barely more than a trickle. "Thistledown is here," Jesha said suddenly, her cat-like eyes widening in surprise. "How did he know where to find us?" Lochnar ignored her, turning to watch Lorenessa as Thistledown walked up the stairs. Just before Thistledown reached the door, Lochnar felt a small flash of another spirit's presence in the building, and then it was gone, but not before Lochnar recognized it. Feeling the molten fire rage fill his blood once more, he jerked his sword out at the same time that he pulled his Aeri back through the link that he shared with Thistledown until his entire spirit was hidden in the realm of negatives. Pulling his body back into the realm of negatives was always a painful process, requiring him to sustain his body's functions with his spiritual energy. Jared had caught him by surprise the last time they met, leaving him less alive than a garden slug. He had also left Lochnar a changed person, inadvertently giving him the keys to a world that he alone understood. The door banged open, and Thistledown rushed in, looking at the spot where he knew Lochnar was standing, though his physical eyes saw nothing. "What's going on?" he demanded, looking around the room for a threat. "We have company coming." Lochnar answered almost a purr. "And now that Kalath is gone, I think he'll be brave enough to come out in the open."